Hi guys. This is going to be one of your first online lectures. I'll generally try to do this if I'm not here, but this will start out your year. So chapter 1, as you guys read, pretty much covers a lot of stuff that you've covered over the past few years in history classes, and world history in particular. So we're going to try to breeze through a lot of this quickly because you've gotten it like every year for the past 3 years. So just a couple quick things. Just a reminder that there was an estimated 13 to 50 million people living in the Americas before Columbus. It's hard to get an exact estimate for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them include lack of written languages, disease killing people off before we could get there, differing opinions on what archaeology means. That's also really important as we kind of go into interactions between Europeans and most of the tribes. And that's really important just to understand that a lot of tribes actually experienced epidemics before meeting Europeans. So it's not necessarily that Europeans met every single tribe and then directly gave them diseases and wiped them out. Like a lot of disease traveled before Europeans could travel to get there too. And so you see a lot of these villages which are totally decimated, and that's part of why Europeans are going to be able to conquer, and that's also part of why, a lot of history and a lot of whatever gets disappears throughout all of that. So when we look at pre-Columbian civilizations, we really want to look back at how they evolved independently, right? These are all people who individually had different societies, and those societies aren't all the same. So that's kind of the biggest takeaway to get from all of this, if we're just going to sum it up. Not all Native American civilizations are the same civilization. Some of them were very warlike, some of them were very peaceful. It just depends on where you are. Our theory of how people first made it to the Americas is over the Bering Strait. I'm hoping this sounds familiar to you guys. People were able to walk over, and then when the ice melted, it flooded, and you couldn't walk over anymore, and they slowly spread throughout the Americas as a whole. So, empires. We've got a couple. The two main ones we're going to look at are the Aztec and the Inca, because those were the two standing empires when Columbus made it over. Ethnically, the rulers of the Aztec Empire were what we call Mexica, and the Aztec were a confederation and a group of different tribes that banded together. But the Mexica were the people who were the senior leadership of the whole empire as a whole. They reigned from about 1325 to 1521. Tenochtitlan is the capital of the Aztec Empire. It is built on a lake and was one of the largest cities in the world. It was founded in 1325, and this is where we see centralized government. So everyone pays tribute here. We are going to see multiple different people, different civilizations, different tribes, all paying into sort of this big centralized government here. After the fall of the Toltec Empire, the whole region here in Central America was in sort of, one of those old states of anarchy. We've seen this throughout world history too, right? Where then you have different competing smaller states to see which one is going to take over. The Mexica commanded the military power that was capable of subduing rival groups and taking over the entire area. The Aztec Empire is probably best known just because it's gruesome, and gruesome things, or just because of the gruesome fact of human sacrifice, right? That's one of those things that just sticks in people's minds of like, oh my God, seriously? They killed all those people sacrificially? And that's crazy and disgusting. So we have a tendency to remember stuff like that. And it's true, hundreds of thousands of people could be sacrificed over the course of a few days. The Aztec were profoundly religious, which is the cause of much of the sacrifice, right? They're feeding their god and appeasing their god. So let's, avoid large-scale human sacrifice in the future. And although their religion inspired large-scale human sacrifice, it also was responsible for a lot of the complex thought and philosophy that develops out of this empire. They question life after death, the meaning of life, our role on Earth, and we can see a lot of this through what they left behind. They also had an advanced agricultural system. I'm hoping a lot of this is kind of ringing a bell here. It wasn't entirely self-sufficient, but you combine that with tributes from neighboring areas, and they did more than survive. They also, and their agriculture were these things called chinampas, which were these gigantic floating, like plots of soil that grew all this stuff. So they could do it on lakes, which was really cool. And then, as a result of their conquest, they created tributary states. So both their tributary states and their allies actually were forced to pay them tribute. And in the end, the fact that they even made their allies pay them tribute ended up being part of how they were conquered. When the Spanish arrive and offer their allies like a better option of like, hey, join us and you don't, or what they thought was a better option, join us, we'll overthrow the Aztec, you don't have to pay them tribute anymore. That's going to sound incredibly appealing, right? And so that's part of how the Aztec will ultimately fall. It's not just, it's more complicated than just the Europeans waltzed in and killed everyone. All right, the capital. When Cortez, who is the Spanish conquistador who captured Tenochtitlan, entered the city, he remarked that the workmanship, quote, the workmanship could not be bettered anywhere. Another conquistador, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, remarked, quote, some soldiers among us who had been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople and all over Italy and in Rome, said that they had never seen so large a marketplace and so full of people and so well regulated and arranged. This is the capital of the city, and everyone was completely enamored. Now, a lot of the city's been completely destroyed, but this is just a recreation of what it probably looked like, and Cortez will ultimately conquer it, but it was a remarkable place. At its height, in about 1500, Tenochtitlan had a population of 250,000 people. If you compare that with other cities at the time, that was huge. London, for example, had maybe 50,000. And again, Tenochtitlan has 250,000. Venice had about 110,000. Paris around 185,000. So these are some of the biggest cities in the world at the time, and Tenochtitlan was bigger. They had huge bridges, which were these big causeways that led to the center of the city. They had a lot of areas dedicated to worship, or to warfare, or to whatever else. They had outlying suburb-esque areas and a sort of sprawling city throughout the area. So this was a really massive place and really, really cool. Next up, we have the Inca. The Inca and the Aztec are not the same. I'm sure we know that. The Inca are going to be in South America, whereas the Aztec are in Central America. They are the largest in terms of amount of land. Of the empires that we've seen, they stretch across about a third of the South American continent at the height of their power. When they were at the height of their power, they were over 2,500 miles long and 500 miles wide and home to over 12 million people. They called themselves the Children of the Sun, which deeply plays into their religious beliefs. And we think they rose, the very beginnings arose sometime in the 13th century, but were united fully under one leadership from about 1433 to 1533. Oh, what else do you need to know? Again, a lot of their center is in the Andes Mountains. So we've got parts in Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, but the mountain area is the biggest. Francisco Pizarro is going to be the person who ultimately conquers the Inca. He arrives in 1526, and finally is granted the ability granted, quote unquote, from the Spanish government, the ability to take the Incan Empire. Unfortunately for the Inca, this was horrible timing. Pizarro marched into the Incan Empire when they were already in the middle of a civil war, and smallpox was already spreading through the entire region. Ultimately, smallpox will claim between an estimated 60 to 95% of the population. So this is, right, you're already fighting a civil war, and then you're already seeing your whole civilization crumble from disease. And then you have a conquistador march in and try to overthrow you. So again, it's like, just like with the Aztec, it's a little bit more complicated than just, they were incapable of defending themselves. They had a lot of other stuff going on as well. Now, the Inca didn't actually totally fold. We see resistance that hangs out for several decades after the fall of the Incan Empire. And then, just to mention this too, right? The Incans were also the people who built Machu Picchu, which was discovered later, rediscovered, I should say, in the 1900s by an explorer who then was like, whoa, this is this crazy preserved thing. So that's part of why it's so world famous, is because it wasn't trampled over decades and looted by other people trying to take relics and stuff. So there's a lot of really cool preservation there. All right, we're going to move up to North America, and we're going to focus a little bit more here to go through some of the differences, because I don't think you cover this quite as in depth in world history. Maybe you do. I don't know. So moving up to North America. There are chiefdoms and confederacies mostly in the North American area, and there are a lot of them. This is the most common form of civilization in the Americas, so rather than a massive empire, it was smaller chiefdoms or confederacies of different groups. Each of these groups are going to develop differently, and they develop according to the environment in which they lived. Again, think Guns, Germs, and Steel. Think Jared Diamond, right? These are incredibly diverse groups, and each group will adapt given the environment that they're in. So if you have a chiefdom living in, like the Anasazi, living in the desert in the Southwest, their cultural practices, their norms, their gods, so much of this will develop differently and based on their needs and what they're experiencing day to day living in an arid desert. And then if you contrast that with like the Iroquois living up in the mountains filled with trees and rain, that's going to have a big influence too on how they develop. So we're seeing many different cultures with a massive variety grow and spring up because in response to the cultural elements that develop there. So one of the first things, I guess I hear two major things about Native Americans in modern day culture, more or less. The first is, all of the Native Americans were just so peaceful and they worshiped the earth and the sky and everyone lived happily and harmonious together and everything would be so perfect if we lived just like them. And the second is something more along the lines of, well, the natives were all violent too. They scalped people and they were at war with each other for ages. It's not our fault. Now, the commonality here that I'm hoping you can pick up on is this assumption that they are all the same, right? Not all native peoples are the same. This is so far from the truth. In fact, both of those statements are true. Well, not entirely, but there were societies that were incredibly peaceful, and there were societies that were incredibly violent. There were matriarchal societies. There were patriarchal societies. There were societies that were nomadic. There were societies that were sedentary. There were societies that hunted and gathered. There were societies that did agriculture. There are so many diversities. In fact, there's over 200 different languages that were spoken. So this is a really big point, and it's one of the biggest ones that I think that you should take away from this, is just even the most basic sense that Native American tribes in the Americas were not all the same. When we talk about Native Americans or American Indians, we are not talking about the same group of people, right? Each one of these different heritages is so different, and each one of these tribal patterns is so different. And so that's going to affect how they interact with us, and that's also, unfortunately, going to have an effect on sort of all natives as a whole as well. So I just keep that in mind, please. They're not one people. They are very diverse. Just like we saw in Europe, there's tons of different peoples and cultures and languages too. And this is even bigger with even more diversity. All right. So first we're going to look at the Mississippians. They were from about 1200 to 1500. They were a chiefdom. They were led largely on maize and bean agriculture. They were also called the Hopewell people. And we kind of refer as a whole to many different settlements that are along the Mississippi River, which have similar sort of bases and commonalities in tribal structures and religion. Chiefdoms are political organizations that are a little smaller than kingdoms or empires. They tend to be run democratically by a chief, but with like input from other people as well. They're sort of like an in-between. We will see the term mound builder also come in response to this, because we would see these massive mounds that were created. The mounds could be could cover over 15 acres, and then they would be built up from there. So these were huge gathering points and sort of like pyramids made of dirt or clay, right? Pyramids made of the materials that they had at the time. Now, the term mound builder actually was first created by Europeans in the 1800s. And they called the mound builder, they applied the mound builders. Their basic theory was that there was a race of people who constructed these earthworks who went extinct, and those people were giants because they didn't believe that Native Americans were capable of building the mounds, so they believed that there had been a previous race that existed there that were larger than normal humans that constructed those mounds. There has never been any evidence of this. This is just not true. Okay. Sorry, quick pause. Back to this. Okay. So Cahokia is going to be a settlement of about 10,000 people that develops, and they are going to create something that we later call Monk's Mound. It is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, but it is built out of mud, again, rather than stone. It's constructed of 4 layers total, so it's way larger than it was originally, or it would have been larger than it is now. Obviously, erosion and damage and history has had a big impact on that. But yeah. Moving on, we have the Iroquois. So the Iroquois live in the Northeast, and they live in a lot of the woodlands of the Northeast. We're going to have a lot of contact with the Iroquois in early American history because of their location. The Iroquois were a confederation. They comprised of 5 tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. They have a 6th tribe that ends up joining after the original 5 nations were formed, the Tuscarora, but that's okay. You don't need to have all of those memorized. They actually established a union of nations before any European contact. It was probably re-solidified in the 1400s, although there were also likely initial treaties that existed as early as the 1100s. But essentially, it's a peace treaty, and it's an agreement to all work together in the best interests of themselves. The Iroquois have a very complex social structure. They are not a group of divided backwoods people. They were incredibly advanced. And we'll look at them a lot more in depth as we get into it. But the Founding Fathers actually incorporated a lot of similar ideas in terms of the cooperation between states that the Iroquois had between their tribes. The Iroquois were both farmers and hunters. They hunted as well, but they also farmed maize, bean, and squash. They are matrilineal, which means that women are in charge, like how you trace your lineage goes down through women. But that being said, they actually have a very sort of balanced society in terms of the roles for people. Both men and women have very important roles within the society. So women were in charge of the longhouses, and you can see an example of a longhouse there. So that means that when a man and a woman would marry, the man would move into his wife's mother's longhouse and reside there, and that would be their home. So women hold claim over land and lineage. They also could divorce an unsatisfactory husband, which, as we will see, is going to be a very big deal and takes a lot of societies a long time to get there. And children will gain their social status through their mother's line rather than their father's line. But that being said, men are absolutely essential in helping guide and raise the children to be more productive members of society. They are in charge politically speaking, so they tend to be the leaders of the clan. They tend to make a lot of the decisions about when and where and how we go into warfare. But it's also the wise women, the clan mothers, who had all already, been married, had children and grandchildren, their partners had died. So the wise women of the town, the clan mothers, actually, even though the men were the leaders, the wise women could dispose of the leaders if they didn't feel like they were doing a good job. So sort of like a check and balance-esque type of power. So while the leaders could make a lot of these decisions, the clan women could also be like, hey, you're making the wrong decisions, you're totally screwing up, like we're going to get rid of you and appoint new people. So there's an interesting balance of power and dynamic here, which is really cool, in my opinion. Doesn't have to be in your opinion. Next up, we're going to move to the Great Lakes. So If you look at the map of the U.S. hanging on this wall, the wall in the classroom, the Great Lakes are up by Wisconsin and Michigan and anywhere else touching the Great Lakes. So those are the big lakes up there, and there's a lot of, depending on where you lived, but there's a lot of similarities between the tribes who grew up around the Great Lakes as a whole. There's a big hold to clan identities. So having your different, your clan is sort of like your home base and where you grew up and your main identity, but they also work together very, very well. And we'll see that confederation grow stronger and stronger as Europeans begin to push into their territory. They're also extremely mobile. So they have extensive trading networks, military alliances, group ceremonies, religious ceremonies, and festivals. And because they're on water and it's fairly easy to travel, especially with canoes, there's a lot of mobility across the lakes as a whole, and therefore we see a lot of shared culture. And then we have the Great Plains and the Rockies. Now we're going to go into the Great Plains in much more in depth as we get further into the year. But one of the biggest things to remember is that before European contact, the native tribes of the Great Plains are very different than how we remember them. So pre-European contact, you have small dispersed groups. They're mostly hunters and gatherers. But post-European contact, horses come into play. And horses will fundamentally change everything. Now, the biggest thing that we're going to see, and so also just to note, it's important to remember that when we think of like the stereotypical Native American, we tend to think of a Plains Indian, right? So that's where you're going to see the big feathered headdresses. That's where you're going to see the horseback riding, the hunting, all of that. So Plains tribes have a tendency to be nomadic. They generally follow buffalo around. So as the herds move, the Plains tribes move with them and hunt them and use them as their main source of food. And horses are essential for doing that. We also will see a lot of ritualistic warfare between tribes on the plains. So war is very much ingrained into their culture too, and the honor of the warrior and that role. So we're going to go into this in more detail later. But just know that these tribes really developed in response to interactions or in response to trading with horses. And they did get horses before they ever made contact with Europeans through the trading networks that we see come up through the Aztec Empire and up into North America. And then we see wild horses, and then we start breeding horses, and it moves from there. But buffalo are going to be a core part of their livelihood. And again, because they're very war is such a huge part of their culture as well, we're going to see a lot of clashes, and this is where we get a lot of the horror stories coming back, which impact how Americans and settlers see the Indians because of the scalpings and the mutilations and things like that. And then that in turn causes us to be even more violent, and it spirals. All right, and then we have the Anasazi. So the Anasazi are in the southwestern United States. This is Arizona, New Mexico territory. They actually had irrigation and agriculture and incredibly innovative architecture. They were often called the Cliff Dwellers. You can still go see some of these settlements today. They were the cultural predecessor. They were the cultural predecessors of the Pueblo people who are still around today. And they actually have extensive interaction with the Spanish and do a lot of trade with the Spanish. They also cultivate the Three Sisters, corn, bean, and squash. And their height really is between 700 and 1100 AD. But we see this massive increase in population. But we also will see sort of a decline in by the time the Europeans come around, they're on the declining end of their civilization. So they're not at the height. We see that a little bit early on. There's a lot of trade. It's one of the biggest things that we're going to see between the Spanish and the Anasazi. And they're sort of like a pipeline into a lot of the trade going up into North America and contact there as well. And we also see a lot of pottery come out of the Anasazi. So for food storage or for water or for whatever else, but their pottery was beautiful. Again, I'm hoping by the end of this you're getting that everyone is incredibly diverse, right? So we have incredibly diverse groups of people. This is not just one people. There are 200 languages. There are many different ways to live. There are many different emphases in different cultures, which is important. And then the other big thing to point out is just that reminder of guns, germs, and steel, right? The environment impacts culture and society. So like you saw, the resources that you have, the environment that you live in will impact how your people develop. And that is true universally, so we're going to keep looking at that. I have a short video for you to watch here, but we're going to wait to show it to you when I come back, so we'll watch this on Tuesday for you guys. All right. We are heading back to look at what's going on in Europe. So real quick recap over on the other side here. So while many other civilizations throughout the world are thriving, Europe is going to be in the Dark Ages when we pick up, right? Lots of stuff isn't super great for Europeans during the Dark Ages. We've got feudalism going, there's peasants and more peasants being miserable, and then there's the lords, and we've got the knights, and they're all fighting each other, and everything's like pretty dirty and pretty cold and pretty muddy all the time, unless you're really, really rich, and then even then, like, disease, teeth falling out, like it's not a great time for Europe. Mostly, especially in sort of the outer reaches, this is when we're seeing Christianity, start to come fully into swing. So with the adoption of Christianity by the Roman emperor, we see so once Constantine adopts that, then we're going to see everybody slowly begin to adopt it, slowly. And so we're seeing Christianity move up through Europe, but it's also attempting to kind of overtake pagan traditions and pagan themes, and that's being sort of overlaid. But that begins spreading up into Europe, and we have the Catholic Church develop. And so suddenly everyone's Catholic, and the church has a whole lot of power. And remember, this is before we see any sort of split within Christianity. So if you're Christian, that also means that you're Catholic at this time. The church is very wealthy. People give the church lots of money. The church goes very, very large and incredibly politically influential. But through all of this, we also, again, see some thriving things happening in other parts of the world. For example, we have a lot of scholars in the Middle East, and we have a lot of incredible civilizations developing there, and they still have medicine, kind of. No one really has medicine at this time period. We are seeing math and astronomy and philosophy and geography and all of that. But one of the things to note in terms of our relationship with Europe here is that we begin to see trade developing between the Islamic empires and between Europe. We come to figure out that they have some pretty neat stuff. So, Italian city-states start getting interested and are like, can we get in on that trade stuff? We kind of like the stuff you have. It's all high-end. It's pretty cool. We want some. But also the Catholic Church is getting incredibly powerful, and they're like, so how about the Crusades? Like, we have these infidels, as they would see them, occupying the Holy Land, and so we see the Catholic Church be like, yes, that stuff is cool. Also, they have the Holy Land, so, like, let's crusade and kill everybody. We need to, a lot of the rhetoric used is, like, repel the invading Muslim hordes, and we also decide that we actually hate the Jews for no particular reason, and we do some pretty terrible things to them during the Crusades and burn a whole bunch of people alive, and really, unfortunately, this becomes a trend. Poor Jewish people. But this is, it's pretty brutal. The Crusades as a whole are pretty brutal, right? But the Crusades give us a trading path and are going to open up. Now, the Crusades occupy several centuries, and we do really smart things like have a children's crusade in which we're like, children are blessed by God, and so they can't die or be pierced by anything, and then of course they all die, but actually not by being pierced by anything. They all drown, which is horrible. But we have a lot of misguided crusades, but this goes on, and we were just fighting and fighting and fighting for hundreds of years. But with the Crusades, we do see an opening up of trade. As people head over to the Middle East, they begin taking this stuff back, and we open up pathways and communication, and suddenly Europeans are like, whoa, there's some super awesome stuff out there. And then people want that super awesome stuff. So they start looking for ways to get that super awesome stuff. This means that we see a huge increase in trade and therefore a huge increase in exploration. But also with that, we see the plague. So the plague gets brought in through this trade, right? It goes through the Silk Road. It's going to slowly spread through Europe. So again, it seems sort of very quick when we look at it objectively, but the height of the plague in Italy is like in the 1300s, whereas the height of the plague in England is like in the 14 or 1500s or something like that. So this is a long time for the plague to slowly spread through and wipe everything out. But people start dying this really horrible, brutal death. Right, so it's awful, and everyone kind of goes crazy because they're like, is God punishing us for our sins? And then a third of the population dies, and it's a excruciating, awful death. But people who survived the plague end up kind of finding out, things and kind of go on the up and up for the people who managed to survive. They can start charging more money for their services because there's less people around, so their jobs are in higher demand. They survived, which is pretty cool too. But also with that, we're going to start to see the rise of the Renaissance. So again, the Renaissance sweeps through too. It starts in Italy and then moves slowly up throughout Europe as well. But people are like, whoa, there's reason and humanism and the world isn't just run by crazy forces and there's all this other stuff. So that's how we see the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, and we start thinking about cool stuff and thinking about the world in new ways and focusing on science and on art and on people and inventions and all of that. And we get really excited. And with that, as we're inventing and looking at the world and being interested in humanity and what humans are like, we also start being like, maybe we could interact with more people. Maybe we could use these inventions to go look for some things. And then, of course, economics has to play a role. So now that we've gotten familiar with our lovely new commodities that are out there, spices, silks, all that cool stuff, we decide we got a way to go find those. So we decided spices are pretty cool and we should find them, which leads us into the age of exploration. So with all of this, it's sort of like this perfect storm of things, right? But as we've opened up trade due to the Crusades and then made things weirdly better with the aftermath of the plague, and when we're in the Renaissance, people are wanting more things, they're more curious about things, we're inventing more things, and those inventions and those desires are ultimately going to push us into the age of exploration. So the world has sort of been opened up to a certain extent. Additionally, the power of the Catholic Church is incredibly strong, especially in Spain, and that's going to provide a secondary motive, right? That's going to be our God part of the conquest. So ultimately, we've got gold, God, and glory, right? Wanting all of those things as we really get into the conquest. Now, part of this too that comes through the Enlightenment is one of the only ways this becomes possible, through the Renaissance, is because we begin inventing stuff and we have some new inventions. So new developments in maritime technology, or like seafaring technology, right, boats, and navigation allow us to explore the world far more successfully than Europeans were capable of before. In 1400, we will develop the caravel with lateen or triangular sails, and the caravella redonda, which are small square sails, and this is going to really impact how we're able to travel and how we're able to navigate, and gives ships much more maneuverability. We also are going to have, decrease our ship size a little bit. So we're going to have small ships that are super uncomfortable, but that are much more maneuverable, which is going to be really effective. In 1460, somewhere in there, I guess 1450, we find a means of determining latitude. So this is the distance north or south from the equator, and that's going to help us be able to plot where we are on the map. Now, we don't actually determine longitude until the 18th century, but at least even with latitude, that's going to help us navigate. And then we also begin mounting artillery on our ships. So this is basically, we start putting cannons on boats so we can shoot other people. The Portuguese are actually going to be one of the first European countries to begin doing this, and this will really change nautical warfare. So now you can sink enemy vessels with gunfire instead of having to physically board them and kill everybody. So it just sort of gives you a little bit more firepower, and you can then ward off other Europeans who are trying to fight you for goods, or other people as a whole. So because with that too, the Portuguese are really going to become the leaders in maritime technology. They're going to be some of the first to really go exploring. And this is largely started by Prince Henry of Portugal. And he was the Prince of Portugal from 1394 to 1460, which is a long time. Actually, I think that might have just been his lifespan. I take that back. Still, that's a decent amount of time to be alive for this time period. So Henry took part in the Crusades, and he saw how wealthy Arab merchants had become by trading gold and slaves across the Sahara, and then trading with everybody as a whole, and sort of being that point where everyone had to trade through, because most trade was done on land. So Henry wanted a piece of the trade, and he creates the Center for Oceanic Navigation. And the Center for Oceanic Navigation was dedicated to exploring and trying to find a direct route to all of the fun stuff that he wanted, like spices and all that. He began sending explorers down the coast of Africa looking to access the ivory, gold, and slave trade in West Africa. So if we look here, right, this is going to be West Africa. So he doesn't just want this part. He wants to try to find a way by sea without going through the Ottoman Empire here to go around so he could have access to Africa there. He finds that the northwest coast was super treacherous, which caused his mariners to do some inventing, and that's where we're going to get like the Caravela Redonda and all that stuff. So with the new technology, the Portuguese vessels are going to be far more efficient in navigating down the coast. They're going to find several islands along the coast, the Madeiras and the Azores, and they're going to colonize them, which also, of course, includes killing and enslaving the local population, as we do. Italian merchants are then going to start getting in on all of this exploration because the Ottoman Empire is pushing them out of the Mediterranean as it's growing in strength, and the Italians still want to make money. Then the Italians will begin to conquer some more islands, and then everyone begins trading. Now, both the Portuguese, led by Henry, and the Italians will continue to fund explorations down the coast of Africa. Now, as they bounced on the coast, they also are setting up trading ports all along the edges. However, that being said, going inland doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for them. Sailors who spent too much time exploring had a tendency to catch yellow fever or malaria or dysentery and die. They also had really well fortified empires and tribes there, so like actually conquering in generally meant death. So we see a lot of just exploration down the coast. And we see a lot of well-fortified trading outposts. So we'll see a lot of coastal trading cities versus like conquering an entire country or people or whatever. Okay, I know this is a lot, but I'm trying to get through this quickly. So, finally, Vasco da Gama will be the first explorer to make it around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. So he finally sails around the tip of Africa and makes it to the Indian Ocean and has access to all of the stuff that we've been wanting. He's able to bring back cinnamon and pepper, and the Portuguese see it and they go, "Oh my God, that's amazing. We want more." So when he returns on his next voyage, he is going to bring a fleet with him. And with the new Portuguese ships, with their mounted artillery, they're able to defeat and defend themselves against Arab ships and begin setting up strongholds in India where they can become a major player in trade. At the same time, Portuguese have also begun experimenting with growing crops on the islands off the coast of Africa that they have conquered. And they find that the environment is very, it lends well to growing sugar. So sugar cane. Sugarcane, however, is incredibly labor-intensive, so in order to grow this first, they decide to enslave the local population. Unfortunately, the local population is an inadequate labor source. There's just not enough people to do the amount of labor that is necessary. So where do we think they turn? If your guess was Africa, you would be correct. Now, we are going to talk about the differences between the slave trade in Africa and the slave ultimately will be what will be the international slave trade later. But just know that there was a slave trade happening in Africa already. So they go to Africa for slaves because that was already established. But this idea of using African labor and importing it to new areas in order to grow sugarcane is what is going to start the international slave trade. And we will get to how we make that jump in a little bit here. All right, so how do the Spanish get involved? Well, if we remember back to world history, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile get married, and their marriage unites two of the most powerful regions in Spain, creating the Spanish Empire. So you can see here, this is the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon. They unite. We have one very powerful Spanish Empire, or the makings of a Spanish Empire. For them, the key to success is national unity and foreign commerce. So in order to achieve this, they begin the Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition, and they begin exploring overseas. One of the key elements here is using Catholicism to build up this sense of Spanishness or a sense of Spanish identity. So this is when they will launch both the Reconquista and then the Spanish Inquisition. So the Reconquista is a push to drive any Muslim Arabs from the European mainland. And they succeed by capturing Granada, which was the last major Islamic territory in Western Europe, and then also by brutally torturing and murdering thousands of suspected Christian heretics, and forcibly converting or expelling any Jews or Muslims who were left, generally with some good old-fashioned torture in there too. By doing both of these, they succeed and forcibly and brutally unify Spain culturally under the guise of Catholicism and capture more territory in the process as well. Now, obviously, there's more to this. I'm sure you learned more about it in world history. It's actually a very fascinating process. But yes, if there are some questions about, well, couldn't you just say you converted and not? Yes, absolutely. People did that, but you just had to be incredibly secretive and hide everything else that you were doing. Some people chose to leave, but the process as a whole was a lot of old-fashioned torture, which if you've ever looked that up, it's pretty gruesome, and a lot of brutality and a lot of death. But they succeed in unifying the country, and they succeed in unifying the country under Catholicism, so it becomes an incredibly Catholic nation. And then with this, they're going to turn their sights on expansion. And so they'll look for a passage west. And this is going to lead us to expansion overseas. So in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So Columbus is actually, first off, he's not Spanish. He's from Genoa, which is in modern-day Italy. And the reason no one would fund him or give him ships until Isabella and Ferdinand is not because there's a common misconception that he was the first person to believe that the earth was round. Again, you've probably gone over all this before too. That's just not true. It was a commonly accepted fact at the time that the earth was round. Columbus's problem is that he was just really bad at math and massively miscalculated the circumference of the earth. So when he went to people, he's like, hey, the earth's actually pretty small, so I can totally just sail west and I can get to Asia. It's going to be great. And everyone's like, dude, no, your math is totally off. There's no way the world is that small. We're not giving you ships. But because Isabella and Ferdinand were very interested in exploring west, they agree. But they only agree to a certain extent. They give him 3 ships, right? It's not like they gave him a massive fleet, but they're like, okay, we really want to get in on this Portuguese trade. We're really curious about how the Italians are doing this. Like, we want to be this massive empire, so we're going to give it a shot, right? What's the worst that could happen? We threw away 3 ships? Not that big of a deal. So Columbus sets sail. His first voyage is between August to October of 1492, and by then he will make it. He believed that he was supposed to have reached Asia a month before he landed in the Bahamas. So if we take a quick minute and just appreciate how bad that calculation was, if you look up at the map on the wall up there, if you find Spain on the big world map, hopefully you all know where that is. If not, look it up on Google right now and figure out where Spain is, because I can't point it to you. But the Bahamas, or the Caribbean, where he first lands, is under Florida. Hopefully you can all find Florida on that map. Again, if you don't know where this is, please look it up so you can get familiar with geography. So he thought that by the time he made it to the Bahamas, he should have been further inland in China at that point. So then if you extend your gaze all the way across the rest of the continent and then across the entire Pacific Ocean, right? He thought he should have been in Asia about 2/3 of the way through the Atlantic Ocean on his way to the Bahamas. That's pretty mind-blowingly incorrect. So he was positive that he was going to make it. Now, also, I think there's something to say about this that just, like, put yourself for a quick second in this mindset of being like, we're going to get on a ship and just see what happens. We have no idea what's out there. Like, that's kind of crazy. And then especially think about being like a worker on that ship and being like, dude, we followed this guy because he said he knew how to do this. And it's been a month since we were supposed to be there a month ago. And we're all starving and we're all angry and everything is awful and we're starting to eat rats and this is terrible. It's pretty crazy. Now, when they finally get there, he's going to land in Cuba and Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti. He's positive he's found the East Indies, right? So what we call Southeast Asia now. He didn't, clearly, but he's still so sure that he did. On top, so he's going to set up like a little settlement at a spot called La Navidad, and then he sails home. Now, just in terms of Columbus, I think it's pretty widely accepted by this point, at least in this community, that he kind of sucks a lot. So, like, there's the obvious, to me, suckage of, like, he conquered and brought over all of these diseases and opened up all of this land with this, decision that he could subjugate all of the natives and kill everybody. But on top of that, his method of killing everybody was like really horrifically brutal, which we'll look at. But more than that, he was just kind of an asshole. Like, he, as a person, when he promised this big reward to whoever spotted land first on his ship. One of his crewmates spotted land and told him, and then he the next day claimed that he had actually spotted it, so he got the big gold cash reward at the very end of all of this. Right? Like, it's even to his own people, he's just not a great dude. Anyways, so they go on their first voyage, they conquer Hispaniola, they leave a settlement, they go back, and they bring some goods and some people, and they're like, hey, look what we found. We found a way here. We can do it. So Isabel and Ferdinand give him more stuff, right? You can see the big difference there. For his second voyage, he gets 17 ships and 1,200 men. On this trip, they're going to make it to Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica. When they go to their settlement, they find it completely destroyed. All of the settlers at La Navidad had been killed after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold and taking women and children as slaves and killing people. So the natives killed them because they were being horrible people. Makes sense. Columbus then starts a new settlement. He moves it a little bit eastward. And that settlement's called La Isabela. It's on the northern coast of Hispaniola. Also proves to be a poorly chosen location, and the settlement ends up not surviving very long. He then heads back home. On his third trip, he finally makes it to mainland South America. He returns to his settlements and repeatedly has to deal with all of these rebellious settlers and the natives. Basically, there were massive problems with Columbus in charge, not only with the native population, but also with his own people. He governed with arrogance. He failed at his promises of gold. He is incredibly unpopular, which will lead to revolts and mutinies, which then leads to him hanging some of his men. Again, overall, not that great. Finally, some of the settlers who return back to Europe lobby against him in the Spanish courts, and they accuse him of gross mismanagement, and when he returns home from his third voyage, he's promptly thrown in jail. He's then finally released and takes his fourth and final voyage, which will take him to Central America. He ends up being stranded in modern-day Jamaica for a year due to a massive storm and hurricane, and finally will return home. Now, Columbus, too, died thinking that he had found Europe and that everything was great and dandy and that everyone should praise him and love him. Or did I say found Europe? I meant found Asia. And that everything was wonderful and he had succeeded, which is completely untrue. The other thing to note is that even though we celebrate Columbus Day here, Columbus never made it to modern-day America. He never made it to North America, right? He went to South, he went to Central, but he never made it up to modern-day America. I'm not quite sure why we think this guy's great. More proof that he is a horrible human. So, in 1495, he's going to start doing a series of slave raids in search of gold. He's positive that there's gold. There was, but there was just little bits of the gold in the streams and the rivers, and he thought that the natives were hiding this massive stash of gold from him. So, he has 1,500 of the local tribe, the Arawaks, all men, women, and children rounded up. He puts them into pens. The Spanish guard them. And he just takes the best 550 quote-unquote specimens and puts them on ships and sends them back to Europe to prove that there was good material for slaves out there, and that's one of the reasons why we should go too. Of the 550, 200 die en route to Europe. He also institutes the copper coin system. He was positive that gold existed there. So one of the observers says, he and his men imagined huge fields of gold to exist. They ordered all persons 14 years older or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. So basically, they were told they had to find an impossible amount of gold. Then they were punished for not having found that amount of gold. This will take a severe toll on the population. In 2 years, as you can see, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead. So that's 2 years. Half were dead. By 1515, there were only 50,000 left. By 1550, 500. And by 1650, the entire Arawak population had been decimated. There are records of mothers killing their recently born children, so infanticide, because they don't want their children to have to live in a world that was so awful and so brutal. People would get limbs or nipples or fingers chopped off just for fun. There's accounts of all of that, and it's awful if you ever want to read it. But this is not good by any sense of the imagination. And Columbus in particular was not a good person. He was a terrible leader, and he did some pretty awful things and encouraged his men to do some pretty awful things. And we will continue to conquer. So I'm going to take a quick break here. All right, guys. Sorry about that. So as we move through this, we're also seeing a bunch of other conquistadors. So it's not just Columbus, obviously. We're going to see a bunch of other people conquer too. And the three major reasons why we're seeing this big push for conquest is God, gold, and glory, right? The 3 Gs. Spreading Catholicism, so in the name of saving people, and the rhetoric is all about saving people's souls, right? So you're doing a very positive thing. Gold, obviously, economics, money is a huge motivator. And glory. Glory for your home country, glory for your king, glory for your queen, all major motivators. Most people, most of the conquistadors are going to be out searching for gold, obviously using these other motives as well, but getting rich is definitely a big motivator here. So we have a few major conquistadors who are fun to talk about. So we've got Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci is one of the first people to declare the Americas as a new land and not India. And the Americas are actually named after him because he would write back about a lot of what he saw. And his first name was Amerigo, so we named the Americas after him. We also have Ferdinand Magellan, who's going to be the first person, kind of, to circumnavigate the globe. He himself doesn't actually circumnavigate the globe, but his ship does. He ends up getting killed in the Philippines pretty brutally, so he doesn't actually make it. Then we have Juan Ponce de Leon, who went searching for the Fountain of Youth in Florida. Going searching for anything in Florida is definitely a dangerous endeavor, and he ends up dead by poison arrow. We also have Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He crosses the Isthmus of Darien, which then becomes Panama, and he actually becomes the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. He ends up getting beheaded by his boss. We have Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, who's the first European to sail the California coast, which is actually what Cabrillo Highway or Highway 1 is named after, and Cabrillo College is named after him. Then, of course, Hernan Cortez, who is best known for conquering the Aztec. He essentially betrayed them, or convinced their allies to betray them. Disease helped, and he tricks them into getting into the city center and then kills everyone. So he pretends to be friends, like Trojan horse type stuff. We also have Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Inca, again, because half their population were already dead thanks to disease, and they were fighting a civil war. So it's not just that they were incapable at fighting, it's not that they were bad warriors, there was a lot of other stuff going on too. So this is going to bring us to Brazil. So the Portuguese actually accidentally discovered Brazil in 1500, thanks to a man named Pedro Álvares Cabral, and they slowly began setting up settlements and trading. And by the 1530s, the king began sending settlers to inhabit the area and planting valuable crops. And what they discover is that the most valuable crop that grows incredibly well in Brazil is sugarcane, particularly on the coastal lowlands. And so Brazil quickly becomes the world's leading exporter of sugar. Now, like we said before, sugarcane is incredibly labor intensive. And how do we get labor? Well, Initially, we enslave the native population, but with disease, that labor source is going to quickly deplete. And how do we think we solve the problem? My hope is that you are thinking that we turn to slaves, because we do. So this is where the African slave trade first develops. The Portuguese begin importing African slaves, just like they had done to the little islands off the coast of Africa. They instead begin sending them all the way across the ocean, which will become known as the Middle Passage, in order to work in the sugarcane fields in Brazil. So that's really quickly how we're going to see the slave trade develop there. All right, so the point of that, sorry, I had to pause again, is that the slave trade is going to start very quickly thanks to sugarcane growing in Brazil. So we're very quickly going to pick that up. So take a quick minute and look at this map, and I want you to just notice, what do you notice? What stands out to you in terms of the colors on the map and who's doing what? Hopefully, it should be something along the lines of, wow, there's a lot of red and purple, which are Spain and Portugal, and not a whole lot of green and yellow, which are England and France. So the question is, why? Where are England and France? What are they doing? Why aren't they getting involved? Why is it Portugal and Spain leading this whole push? Well, the broadest answer is there's a lot of money issues and domestic issues going on at home for both the English and the French. And that's going to be a big deal here, which we'll get into right now. But they're infighting. There's not a lot of money to support this, whereas there is with the Spanish, and that's going to be one of the biggest differences. So that brings us to one of the biggest reasons why the English and French don't start settling until later, but also one of the reasons why we do see a push for settlement in the later years, once everything stabilizes. The biggest thing that's going on is the Protestant Reformation. And I know that you've learned about this every year since 9th grade if you've been at this school, but we're going to learn about it again. So what is this and why is it important to U.S. history? That's the question. So if we go back and remember that Catholicism was a huge thing and the Catholic Church was basically running everything, there starts to be complaints with the extent of power of the church and corruption within the church. And those complaints are led by a German monk named Martin Luther. His aim is to make the church more accessible, and he views the church as incredibly corrupt. One of the biggest things everyone remembers, right, is that he's anti-indulgence, and an indulgence was a way for you to buy away your sins or buy away the sins of someone who is already dead, so essentially buy your way into heaven, right? And so he challenges priests. He begins trying to work with the church, but ultimately is excommunicated for challenging their power and traditions. So the Protestant Reformation officially begins in 1517 when Martin Luther issues his 95 Theses, which include things like faith over works, meaning you can't do this showy like donations or building stuff, do good works and prove that you're just so great by paying people to build stuff and just have that be more important than faith. It's instead the focus is on the faith. Are you a good Christian? Do you believe in God? Do you have this good relationship? You can't buy salvation. He wants to get rid of a lot of the ceremony and therefore get rid of a lot of the corruption. And so this is the first form of Protestantism. John Calvin quickly will get inspired. He moves to Switzerland and will begin preaching Calvinism. And Calvinism quickly becomes popular in England as well as in France and several other places. Calvinism, one of the core tenets is predestination. This is that God has total sovereignty over everyone. God has already determined whether or not you are in heaven. Faith doesn't get you saved. Good works don't get you saved. The chosen ones are already saved. Now, the question then becomes, well, if the chosen ones are already saved, why would I try to live this good, godly life if it doesn't matter, nothing I do matters? Well, the basic idea is that you still need to live like you've been saved because saintly behavior is a sign of salvation and being a chosen one. So if you're living a saintly life, that's a sign that you probably are one of God's chosen people. Whereas if you're not living a saintly life, then the likelihood is you're not one of God's chosen people because he would have chosen to make you saved and live a good, godly life if he was going to save you, if that makes any roundabout sense. The Bible is absolute law. And everyone who is Calvinist basically believes that they have been chosen and they are one of God's chosen people. Very, very, very pious, very stark, very serious. And yeah, so these two religions are going to spread incredibly rapidly and obviously cause tons and tons and tons of tension within the Catholic Church. So this becomes pretty crazy, and we are going to see a lot of fighting and lots and lots of death, lots of burning at the stake, lots of mass murder, lots of beheadings, all of that stuff that we see in Europe. The other two things that are very important to remember, and I really want to emphasize this, are both the printing press and that we are printing in vernacular. So the printing press is going to allow the teachings of Martin Luther and John Calvin, as well as other Protestant Christians, to begin spreading throughout the common people. Traditionally, getting your hands on a book has been incredibly difficult, and now it's going to become increasingly easy with access to the printing press. Suddenly, it becomes far less expensive to produce a book, right? You don't have to write it out all by hand, and so the common people or middle-class people can access them and own them, and so you can get your works out much more efficiently. And second, we begin printing the Bible, as well as a lot of the writings and teachings of Luther and Calvin, in the vernacular language. Vernacular means your local language, right? So in England, the vernacular would be English. In Germany, the vernacular would be German. In Spain, the vernacular would be Spanish. But it's the local language of the people versus writing in Latin, which is what all Bibles were published in before this. So now, the other thing that's added on here is the average person can read the Bible. They can read it in their own language. They don't have to know how to read Latin in order to access the teachings of God. And so now that they have the teachings of God in their hand, they're able to have personal relationships with God develop. They can interpret what they will from the Bible without just having to go through the priest. So in a sense, it almost gets rid of the Catholic, like if you want to look at it in economic terms, it gets rid of the Catholic Church's monopoly over the Bible, over God's word, right? In everyone's mind. And so this is going to cause, again, tons of war, tons of tension, tons of craziness throughout France and England. And so while Spain just sort of like, and Portugal just sort of kicked everyone who wasn't super Catholic out and would burn you at the stake if you were, I mean, the French and the British would do that too. But they weren't as effective as doing this mass cleansing as early as they did before the Protestant Reformation started, as the Spanish were. So the Spanish aren't having to contend with this, whereas the French and the British are, and so their governments are worried about what's going on here, and we'll look at King Henry VIII and all of that later, but that's why they're so sort of preoccupied and why they're not going to jump into the game later. All right, great job, guys, with your first one. Have a great rest of your day. On Monday, you'll start Chapter 2 with Miss Davison, and I will be back on Tuesday to do some more work with you. Have a great weekend.